Over the past 12 months of the Covid-19 pandemic, nations around the world have failed to unite to tackle the borderless virus. Instead, existing divisions both within and between countries have worsened in the face of common challenges, from enforcing lockdowns and mask wearing to procuring vaccine supplies. Now, all of this has really underscored the necessity of strong national leadership and global coordination, not only to beat the virus, but also to overcome the numerous challenges that countries will face beyond the pandemic. For clues on how to build back better and together, we connect with our guest who needs no introduction at all, the Most Honourable Mr. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. He led Britain through a decade of record economic growth while introducing major reforms to expand healthcare, education and labour rights, including the UK's first ever minimum wage. Mr. Blair is also known for his role in global governance, having supported efforts for peace and democracy even after leaving office. He founded the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, a leading think tank for practical policy solutions to some of the world's most difficult challenges. Welcome to the show, Mr. Blair. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks very much, Sue Young, and it's very good to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, no, thank you. And well, amid this pandemic that we're in, 17 years ago, actually, during the SARS outbreak in China, you stressed the importance of preparing against future epidemics, although it was at the time seen as a non-traditional security issue. And while the past has really proven that your advice was not heeded and many parts of the world were very unprepared. So since you saw this kind of crisis coming, we'd really like to hear your advice on what should be done to get out of it. So what kind of national leadership is needed and how can governments really prepare for a strong exit that minimises the fallout on people's livelihoods?
Thank you. I think there are two things really. The first is what national governments have to do. So actually South Korea has been one of the countries that's done best through the course of this pandemic. The UK's had a very high number of deaths, over 120,000 for COVID-19, but we're doing well now on vaccinations, where we're vaccinating the population reasonably quickly. I think for the national leadership, the important thing is to put in place the infrastructure you're going to need for the future. That's around vaccine production, around research and development, testing, and making sure that we have tests that are rapid and easy to use, and putting in place also the ability to have early warning of possible new mutations, either of COVID-19 or outbreaks of new pandemic. But then I think on the global leadership side, there's an immense amount the world's got to do. I mean, the truth is now everyone around the world is trying to get vaccines as fast as they possibly can. We have a large part of vaccine production in the world not being used for the production of COVID-19 vaccines. And, at the moment, I think it's going to be very difficult for many of the poorest countries in the world to get vaccines much beyond the end of this year or into next year. So I think there's an enormous amount the world has got to do together, as well as countries do individually. And if we had that global cooperation, then I think we would be able to cut the time taken to deal with these types of pandemics radically. If we had better cooperation around data and surveillance, around research and development, the development of new vaccines and antiviral biologics, and also then, of course, the ability to distribute vaccine at scale.
And looking beyond this pandemic, there are many global challenges ahead that call for global cooperation. And one of them being the competition and rivalry between the United States and China, that looks pretty set to continue. And while America's allies mostly seem to agree that concerns such as human rights and aggressive territorial claims need to be addressed, it seems, they do share very strong economic ties with China, and it looks like President Xi Jinping intends to stay in power for quite a long time. And over the years, the Western world failed to turn China into a more liberal or democratic country through trade liberalization and globalization. Do you think it's still possible to change Beijing's behavior? And how do you think countries should engage with China? What should really be the red lines?
It's a huge challenge for 21st century geopolitics, because the rise of China is quite natural. It's the largest population country in the world. It will be the largest economy in the world. It's natural that China is a great power, both economically and therefore militarily and politically. On the other hand, I think what is really important is that the West, and by the West, I mean not just the US and Europe, but I mean democracies in the world more generally. And that includes, of course, South Korea, Australia, Canada, India. I think what is important is for those countries to take a unified approach to China and recognize that there are going to be areas where we will be confronting China if Chinese behavior contravenes basic international norms. There will be areas where for sure we're going to be competing with China, technology being one very obvious example. But I think we do need to reserve a space for cooperation, because whether it's dealing with this pandemic or it's, for example, around issues of climate change, we're going to need that cooperation with China. As you rightly point out, the Chinese economy is so interwoven with the global economy. And one of the reasons why, for example, inflation in countries like Britain has kept low over these past 2 decades has been cheap goods produced out of China. So you've got to try and take a strategic approach to China, but that approach is much more likely to work and much more likely to influence Beijing positively if it's done in a way where the democracies of the world stand together.
And the UK is hosting the G7 summit in Cornwall this summer, which many expect to be formally expanded into a D10. With many global challenges ahead, are you optimistic about this group? And what do you hope to see South Korea contribute?
I mean, I'm optimistic in the sense that I think that the case for global cooperation is so strong. And we've had outbreaks around the world of nationalism. And of course, if you're a prime minister or the leader of a country, your first job is to your own people. But the reason for global cooperation today is what I would call enlightened self-interest. In other words, when countries cooperate together, for example, on climate change or on this pandemic, it's not because they're putting other countries before their own country. It's because they're recognizing that for your own country to be safe and secure, you require to be part of a global process of cooperation. So I think the G7 actually has an opportunity to rehabilitate itself. A lot of effort has moved towards the G20 in recent years, but obviously with the tensions between America and China and the West and China, the G20 may be more constrained in the future, whereas the G7, there is a sense of shared values as well as shared interests.
So with South Korea's own President Moon Jae-in going to the UK for this summit, what do you hope to see from South Korea?
Well, South Korea's got an enormous role to play. I mean, it's a very important country. It's a dynamic economy. It actually leads in many of the things that the world needs. For example, you're a big producer of bioreactor capacity. You have this partnership. South Korea has a partnership with AstraZeneca to produce vaccine. South Korea is obviously in a very, very delicate but extremely important strategic place in Asia. So South Korea, I think, has a lot to offer, and I think its contribution to the G7 will be really important. I mean, I remember from my own visits to South Korea in the past, it's a country that's got a very, very special place in world politics today. The Korean Peninsula is important for all the reasons we know, but South Korea itself is a country that has shown how you can come from a really quite a poor set of conditions to become one of the leading countries of the world today. So it's got a lot to teach the world.
And well, many say that former US President Donald Trump's handling of foreign policy really damaged the credibility of America's role in global governance and also weakened international institutions like the WTO and the World Health Organization, as this pandemic has proven. Do you see a bigger role for countries like the UK and South Korea to restore multilateralism and also strengthen liberal democracy? And in particular, do you see any room for collaboration between the two countries?
Well, I certainly think the UK and South Korea can do lots together. I mean, we've both got economies that are very much linked to the world. As I say, if you just take the field of bioscience, there are a lot of shared interests, and of course there are deep shared values. So, countries the size of the UK and South Korea, in today's world, which is going to be dominated, the geopolitics of the 21st century will be dominated by the United States, China, probably in time India, and that's for reasons of size of economy and size of population. But those countries that do have dynamic economies and have a very strong and clear set of political principles by which they operate, like the UK and South Korea, they've still got a big role to play because they've got a lot of different alliances. They're very strategically placed in the world. And so, even if they're not as powerful as those sort of giants, US, China, India, and so on, they're nonetheless countries that have respect in the world and are able to therefore build alliances, and build alliances not just to defend interests, though that's important, but also to defend values, because those values of freedom, liberal democracy are important values for the world.
With the new Biden administration in the United States, one of America's major foreign policy tasks is to handle a nuclear North Korea. And you were Prime Minister in 2006 when North Korea tested its first nuclear weapon. But now the North claims to be able to target the US mainland with its intercontinental ballistic missiles. And in recent years, the Obama administration's policy of strategic patience, that was seen as being a bit too passive. And then, of course, we saw the bromance between Mr. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un really evaporate without a deal due to the differences over the terms of denuclearization and the sort of incentives North Korea would get for each step. What kind of approach do you think is needed?
All of us who in office and out of office have tried to deal with the issue of North Korea have found it incredibly difficult, because it's a unique regime. The country is completely closed off, actually, over the past year as a result of COVID, even more closed off, with a leadership that is predictable only in its unpredictability. So I think the most important thing is that the leading powers work together on it. This is an area, by the way, where we definitely need China's cooperation and engagement, and it's going to be a matter of trying to handle North Korea and handle it until eventually things change there, which of course they will ultimately. One of the things my institute works on around the world is we help governments promote reform and make change, and the whole basis behind my institute is to say, we have clear examples today of what works and what doesn't in how you govern a country and how you help its people and how countries make progress. And if you look at the Korean Peninsula and you compare South Korea and North Korea, it's the biggest demonstration of the difference governance makes that humanity's probably ever seen. There's South Korea now, first world country, and North Korea, as we know, a regime that I'm afraid treats its people in a truly terrible way. So it's dealing with North Korea is always going to be really, really difficult, but it's an area where the key powers of the world have got to cooperate and try and find a way of managing the country, try and find, if possible, a way of leading the country out of its isolation and frankly the backward nature of its governance.
So in terms of engaging the regime and talking about denuclearization, well, you oversaw the historic Northern Ireland peace agreement in 1998, and over the years you've really advocated a regional or multilateral approach to peace deals. Would you recommend the same for perhaps the next round of nuclear talks with North Korea? And do you also see Britain rejoining the conversation and really reviving its role as an important player during as it was during the six-party talks?
Well, I think Britain would be open to that, but you've got to see, it's a decision really for the government in place now in the UK and the other key players to decide. But I'm sure, and I know Britain will want to play as constructive a role as possible. I always think it's right to engage, even when you may disagree very strongly. So I'm not at all against the engagement of North Korea and its leadership. The question is, as Donald Trump found, is once you engage, what then happens? And is it possible for North Korea to be brought to a different attitude to the world, because at the moment, their entire policy is based on keeping their country closed off in developing nuclear weapons capability in order that they preserve the existing nature of their regime. Now, I don't think that has any possibility of working long term for its people. But the question really is, can you, by a process of engagement, bring about a different attitude on the part of its leadership? And that's the question, as I was saying to you earlier, that people have wrestled with, for the last 2 decades or more. But I have to say, at the moment, without a great deal of success.
Well, we've taken up quite a lot of your time, but before we let you go, we get to maybe the most important question. Have you recently listened to any K-pop songs?
K-pop. So I haven't moved much beyond sort of Gangnam Style in K-pop. Below, I was saying to you that before we got on that my hair is I've been unable to get a haircut through COVID. So my hair has not been this long since I was in a rock band myself many years ago. But you've got some great K-pop, and I actually listened to a song the other day, which I do in the gym. There was a collaboration between one of your groups and Dua Lipa, I think, was it Blackpink? Is it?
Yes, that would be Blackpink. And
yeah, right. So it's amazing. It's an interesting thing, though. You see, when a country like South Korea, it gets to the next level of engagement, its culture explodes as well. South Korean films, by the way, are now a hot item worldwide, and interesting films and interesting, the dynamism within your cultural scene is a very, very important part of the identity of your country today. And you see it in popular culture, you see it in film and art, and it's a great thing. South Korea is a really interesting country because of where you're situated, where you've come from, and where you are. And the question for the future is it how's it going to be for you, given that you occupy this very, very special place, and the explosion of cultural talent in South Korea is a very interesting part of the character of the country. So I hope when everything settles down, I get to come and visit again.
We really hope to have you in the country, back in the country as well, Mr. Blair. And if I may say so, your hair is quite K-pop. It's very BTS. So it's very current.
I'm a little old for it now, but I love listening to the music that people listen to today, because it always gives you a clue as to what they're thinking.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Blair. It was an absolute honor speaking with you.
Thanks, Soo Young. Thank you very much.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.